Thanks very much. Welcome to this afternoon's session. For those of you I haven't met yet, I'm Milton Catlin, and I'm the Secretary General of the International Gas Union. You may not know the International Gas Union except through these exhibitions. We are one-third owner of the LNG series of conferences, and we're also whole owners of the World Gas Conference and the IGRC conference series. The IGU, for its part, is Industry Membership Association, so if you haven't joined, now's the time to please join up. It's 90 years old, it has something like 150 members in 80 countries, and its membership covers the entire gas value chain. The Council of the IGU took a decision a few years ago that the word gas and our activities should cover more than natural gas. So the gas that we look after includes natural gas, renewable, low and zero carbon gases. And our mission as an association is to demonstrate that gas is an integral part of a sustainable global energy system and to promote the political, technical and economic progress of the industry. So I suppose at its heart, the IGU is interested in keeping gases flowing today to our consumers and customers and ensuring that lower carbon energy is available in the future. My experience, for those of you who've looked at my bio, is relatively new to the international gas industry, but I'm sure you can see from the sort of panelists we've got today that we have a wealth of experience. I think together they account for something like more than 110 years of experience in the international gas and oil industry. There's certainly a geographic spread amongst our panelists. We've got the Caribbean, Latin America, Africa, Australia, Europe, Middle East, USA and Canada. And at least one of them, and I'll leave you to figure this out yourself, has been named as one of Canada's most powerful women. If I could, actually I'll move now and I'll introduce the panelists in order. So if you could just say hello to, first of all, Mark Loken, President of National Gas Company of Trinidad and Tobago. Kevin Gallagher, Managing Director and CEO of Santos. Delaray Venter, CEO of MidOcean Energy and Managing Director, EIG. And Cynthia Hansen, Executive Vice President and President, Gas Transmission and Midstream at Enbridge. So I think at this part we move straight into introductions from each of our panelists. So if I could ask each panelist in turn from my left onwards to just make an opening statement, perhaps introduce themselves and their interest in this subject.
Mark Loken, President of the National Gas Company of Trinidad and Tobago. We're essentially an integrated energy player across the entire chain. We are starting to grow in various fields, including the green agenda, and looking to change structures and shapes and forms while we focus and to diversify our business strategy while still focusing very much on energy security, which we'll get into later on.
Kevin.
Thank you, Milton, and good afternoon, everyone. Look, I believe that abated oil and gas is going to play a very big part of the energy mix, not only in Australia, but across Asia and globally for many decades to come. And that's because in Asia, all forecasts show that by 2050, gas demand is expected to increase by around 50% as those Asian countries continue to develop their economies and bring people out of poverty. The IEA itself has said recently that a failure to invest in fossil fuels will only result in energy prices increasing and, of course, will not guarantee a secure transition. And we've seen evidence of that, I think, over the course of the last 18 months or so. And I believe that Australia, therefore, has a responsibility and an obligation to leverage off of its very huge natural gas resources, its significant existing LNG infrastructure, its CCS potential, and, of course, its proximity to those Asian markets to deliver affordable, reliable, and low-carbon energy solutions. And that's why I'm excited about what Santos is doing right now which is developing 3 very large CCS hubs in Australia to support our region on that decarbonising journey. And that's part of our Energy Solutions division ambition to build a very large and significant CCS or CCUS business by 2050. And although government policies have not really been supportive of that, as they've really focused, I think, over the last few years on demonising the oil and gas industry as opposed to incentivise them to lead the transition, I do get encouraged when I see, albeit very slowly, those policies beginning to align around supporting that vision that has abated oil and gas being a big part of the energy mix for decades to come.
Great. Mark? Oh, sorry, Delaray.
Thank you, Milton. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Delaray Fenter, CEO of MidOcean Energy. It's a new global LNG investment company backed by EIG Energy Partners of Washington, D.C. Milton, thanks for the introduction. Let me start first and foremost by stating my overarching view when it comes to the topic of this panel, and that is that natural gas demand will be alive and well in the energy system of 2050. There are many reasons for that. 3 that comes to mind. First is the need to underpin the massive increase in electrification of the global energy system that must happen and that will happen. And policymakers today understand just how critical it is that something underpins this massive increase in electrification. And that something needs to be available today, not in 2035, not in 2045, but today. And in the 2 decades that I've been intimately involved with advocacy for gas, this is the first time that I sense that policymakers around the world gets this reality. The second reason for my belief is that a lot of the growth in LNG, in gas demand, will come through LNG. Because when you look where demand for gas is growing and will continue to grow in the decades ahead, you can only connect that by ship and not by pipe. And most of this new demand, especially demand east of Suez, which can cause the LNG industry to double in size over the coming decades, is structural demand. That's demand that's going to be there for decades to come. The third reason for my belief is that we, humankind, always overestimate the pace at which change can happen in the energy system, and the pace and the time that it takes to scale up anything new. I saw a great piece of research recently that looked at all of the innovations that changed the world we live in the last 150 years. Think electricity, television, landline, mobiles, etc. And the conclusion of that piece of research was that it takes on average 35 years for any of these new game-changing technologies to reach 90% of their potential. And that is after they have passed the test of being commercially and technically good to go. And the timeline is even longer for capital-intensive, capital-heavy industries like much of what we're dealing with in the energy system. So in conclusion, I don't see large-scale substitution of gas demand outside of Europe in the coming decades. In most places, new technologies will gradually take an increasing share of incremental demand, but it's an additive and evolutionary change process. And therefore, long-term demand for gas and also for LNG is just not something that keeps me awake at night.
Great. Cynthia, introduce yourself, please.
Thank you, Milton, and thank you for everybody coming to listen to this panel today. And I'm just going to build a bit on what the other panelists have said. So my name's Cynthia Hansen. I'm the EVP and President for Gas Transmission and Midstream at Enbridge. And what I do know is that we need energy to fuel our way of life. And it is critically important for our whole economic being. And that's in a place like Canada or in the US where when you flip a switch on in the morning, you get electricity. And that is not guaranteed, as we've heard in many places of the world. And I believe as well that you're going to have that opportunity to grow in many other places in the world, and that's going to require energy. So that gives me a lot of comfort that there will be continued demand for natural gas, and particularly LNG. We know that, speaking from our position where we operate in North America, we currently operate as well in some of our, in 5 of the G5 locations with some of our renewable platforms, but a lot of our assets are based here in Canada and the US, and we support the development of LNG. We've invested in the Woodfibre project here in BC, and we have a lot of infrastructure that's supporting the US Gulf Coast LNG infrastructure. And as was mentioned, there's lots of growth opportunities. Yesterday, there was some information shared through the LNG Association that the U.S. is now in the second largest, based on 2022 data, the second largest exporter of LNG. So they've just bumped Australia out of #2 place, but it's a very close position. So that energy is critically needed as we go forward. And what I do know is that we have in our great industry incredibly talented people. They know how to build this kind of infrastructure. We have that commitment to doing it in a very responsible way so that we are continually committed to lowering our environmental impact. And you probably heard at the conference that in particular BC, where we are today, has some of the opportunities to produce the lowest carbon emitting LNG facilities. So that path forward, I think, is very exciting for us. And I truly believe that we have a lot to contribute in reducing world emissions through using LNG.
Thanks. Well, I think Della Ray has already sort of introduced our first formal question when you spoke about forecasts and forecasts of demand, and you talked about, or you hinted at the frailty of humans or the inability of humans to foretell the future. So I'm going to ask each of you in turn what you see as the energy mix in the decades ahead.
Should I go first?
So anyone?
I can start with just a couple of things. We'll go in the reverse order this time. I would just say that, as was noted, all forecasts that I've say that you're going to have energy demand that's going to increase by at least 50% by 2050. And we know right now that fossil fuels contribute 81% of the overall energy mix right now. So that path forward means, I think, as we've all stated, that there is a critical position for natural gas in the future. So what that exact percentage is, I don't know. I think, truly, it's going to be more than what it is today, and that there is that path forward for us to use LNG in particular to reduce overall emissions. We've seen that in the United States, that switching from to natural gas from coal has had a tremendous impact in reducing overall GHG emissions, so at least 20%. And as I look at what our responsibility is as we go forward to meet the net reductions by net zero by 2050, as was mentioned, it's going to be a combination of all these energy sources, and lowering your overall fugitive emissions from the production of LNG, making sure that you're using electric motives wherever possible, partnering that up with carbon capture and sequestration. All of that will be something that's critically important by 2020 or by 2050.
Okay. Kevin, do you believe the IEA forecasts?
Well, they're not forecasts. They're scenarios,
Yeah.
first of all. And I think that's really important to understand, that they're not forecasts. They're a demonstration of one way to try and achieve something. And the net zero one, I think, has been very harmful to the transition because it's given a tool to a lot of activists to drive their agendas. For example, the comments about there should be no more oil and gas projects developed. And of course, we know that that just cannot happen. And in fact, if you look at that net zero scenario, They are years behind it already, sort of 3 years after they published it, right? So it's just not, it's not even credible anymore. But if you look at all sort of reputable forecasts, they all show that gas will increase in demand and in market share. I agree with Cynthia. I think it will grow. It will not decline. And in our region of Asia, as I said already, the forecasts are all sort of indicating around a 50% growth in demand for gas by 2050. And it's already a pretty large consumer of gas and LNG worldwide. So gas has the flexibility, it has the low land intensity, if you like, that really lends itself to our region. And it is significantly cleaner than oil. And if you think that 70%, in fact 90% of the world's fertilizers, are produced using natural gas. And without that, you'd only be able to feed about 40% of the world's population today. That tells me gas, as populations continue to grow, gas is going to be very much in demand for decades to come.
That's a good point.
If I can build on that, a scenario is not a forecast.
Yeah.
A scenario is a deterministic piece of work that sort of force fits routes to get to a specific outcome. It doesn't make it credible or high probability at all. And in fact, I agree with Kevin. I think the IEA's net zero scenario did more harm than good. In the very same year that scenario came out with sort of a death to gas narrative behind it, the world consumed more coal than ever in its history before. And we're en route to consuming 102 million barrels a day of oil. This fact pattern is entirely inconsistent with what that scenario suggests for the future and many other similar scenarios. And so, I think the question, Hamilton, is, directionally, what do we see as changes in patterns in gas consumption? I think coal will eventually have to be pushed out of the power mix. That means that you will have a geographical shift of gas demand to where most coal is burnt, which is east of Suez. And that, I think, is the one sort of key trend that we will continue to see substantive growth in gas demand and shift between east and west of Suez. And in addition to the power industry, gas will continue to displace liquid fuels in heavy engines and in heavy industry. And I think that's a structural change that we'll continue to see around the world as the second point.
Okay. Mark?
I think these forecasts are confusing because you get on one side of the spectrum what it should be to get a net zero scenario, and you see a lot of those, which of course is showing drastic reductions in fossil fuels and dramatic increases in renewables. That's the one type of forecast that is widely available out there. But then you get, I guess, the more realistic versions of the Gas Export Countries Forum, where you see, a more realistic account of the kind of investment needed, the kind of transition that is needed when you are, in fact, dependent on 80% of fossil fuels right now. And if you take the various issues coming together from this conference, you see energy security, transition, and affordability all being talked about. And if you start to look at the energy security side, then why is it we have, as Dalaray said, actually 20% more coal investment happening in China and India and so on? Why is that going on? It's not to say that I think China and India and so on are ignoring this issue, because you see them as world leaders in solar, in wind, in EVs and electrolyzers, as we heard about today. Same with India, but you see that they can't keep up with the energy needs. And as you start to have the population increases going on there and the energy increases going on there, then you find yourself ramping up on coal, because you just don't have enough of the supply of cleaner fuels, so to speak. So I guess one of the themes that I heard, but it just passed by, was the sort of underinvestment in oil and gas as a result of all these scenarios and forecasts. And I think that is part of the probably it's termed as a coming crisis. You know, if you don't fix that issue and invest in your firm power base, because as we found out, the renewable power, I mean, is still relatively small compared to what is needed. You have figures of 4 trillion a year is needed to kind of make this investment huge numbers. The grids are not sort of connected in a way between gas and electricity so that those things can happen quickly. So as far as sort of the real world is concerned, there is a financial requirement to go from point A to B. It's a bridge that you're building. It requires a combination of coal, oil, gas, and all the renewables as well. So I think there's a conversation in that space about, in terms of forecasts, the realistic, right now the GECF says is 23% and is going to 26% in 2050, as opposed to the first extreme that I spoke about, where everything is just chopped off and then the renewables takes off. That then brings another dimension of the energy trilemma, which is the sustainability. Because as the world is also finding out, the wind stops blowing and the sun stops shining, but it also is happening as a result of the climate change issues. And the climate change issues is also impacting wind currents and the frequency and volatility. And if we take small equations like the wind power generated is directly proportional to the cube of the wind speed and the wind slows down, then you get a big difference in power. So even the managing of existing energy, you can't keep up with it. And the climate change is happening in the meantime. And the 1.5 degrees that we're all aiming for by 2050 seems increasingly difficult unless there is a real acceleration of all these issues. So that's the forecast that I said, therefore, is closer to the 26% that the GECF is putting out, which seems to be more taking into account some of the realistic issues.
Okay. It's not surprising that you're all quite confident and optimistic about the future of natural gas, but I mean, what place is there in that future mix for other things like CCS or synthetic methane, hydrogen, etc.? Kevin, do you want to?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, that's something I'm very excited about. You've heard already in my intro that I talked about Santos' strategy focusing on building a very large CCUS business. And that's not only to decarbonize our operations and our products, but it's to help our customers decarbonize their products. And why that's very important to us, we see a future where LNG is the key to providing that reliable, but very importantly, affordable energy to our Asian region. And in order to do that, we've got to decarbonize it. We've got to decarbonize it. If we go to hydrogen-type export products, and I don't believe that hydrogen will be a viable export product anytime soon. My view is that things like e-methane will bump that out of the way. And why that's important is because you can use all your existing LNG infrastructure, your transport infrastructure, and on the other side of it, the distribution and transmission systems within the host countries. And an example of that is in Japan, I think, because hydrogen is only 1/3 of the density of methane, you'd have to triple the amount of infrastructure, right? And so you can avoid all that change out, the trillions of dollars of infrastructure change out, if you keep using methane, and e-methane gives you that possibility. When I go to Japan and Korea, all my customers talk to me about the road to e-methane. Yeah. And it's using CCS, it's using direct air capture, but it's about using LNG. It's about using LNG facilities and continue to be a buyer of, let's call it, net zero LNG in the future. There is no path to net zero without CCS. I've never seen one scenario that can get you there without a negative carbon technology in the mix. We have to take carbon out of the atmosphere somehow in order to get to net zero. So I think it'll be a huge part. I think by 2050, you'll see a significant portion of oil and gas developments having a CCS component to them. And I expect technologies like direct air capture to play a very large part in helping decarbonize the world's energy mix. Because if you don't, you're going to have to cover half the planet with solar panels and windmills to provide the electricity when the sun is shining and when the wind is blowing.
Well, as an industry, I think we constantly make advances to governments and tell them they're not investing enough in gas infrastructure, not allowing development banks to invest in developing countries, for example. But are they investing enough in CCS and in hydrogen and the other alternatives?
No, if I can just quickly, I don't want to be dominating this part of the conversation, but the answer is no. And it goes back to my point in the intro where I said that governments have kind of tended to demonize oil and gas industry, and yet it's my belief the oil and gas industry is the one industry they should be getting behind to accelerate the transition. Because for that transition to happen, you need the oil and gas industry to transform, and it's things like what you're talking about is going to be part of that transformation, but it takes capital. It takes capital, so starving that same sector of the capital will only slow down that transition. And I've always said, to De La Rey's point, that if you ask people in developing countries to choose between heating and eating, they'll always choose both. And so what does that mean? It means they go back to coal and they go to the lowest cost of energy to allow them to have both of those things. And that's what we saw happen in 2020, 2021.
Absolutely.
And we'll see it again if we keep driving the price of gas up by putting our foot on the hose.
Well, you've raised the issue of developing countries, and I know all of you have had experience in developing countries, but Mark, you've had experience in Africa, the Caribbean.
Yeah, correct.
What is the response there from people in those sorts of regions to calls by OECD countries for rapid decarbonisation?
Well, I think that's also a sort of misguided approach, because if we take what I started off with, the world is going to need energy. And if you look at all the projections, it's going to require 20% of an increase in primary energy in all areas. Where are you finding some of these potential energy sources? Africa, and you find it in the Caribbean. We have spare capacity, as our minister will continuously attest. And therefore, you have to start thinking now of regional solutions to say, you know, I think the narrative of, say, keep your hydrocarbons in the ground is not in keeping with the narrative that says we should be exploring all areas of energy with gas as a firm basis for power. I think there's no solution for the long-term intermittency problem yet. And I think the investments, if we talk about scaling up and trying to get to that 1.5 degrees, I think Bloomberg would say you need 4 times the amount of investment for between now and 2030. You need 6 times for the 2030 to 2040. You need 10 times for 2040 to 2050. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of resources. And therefore, is the right policy to say keep the hydrocarbons in the ground? Yeah. So to me, that is a false narrative, and it really has to now be responded to in a manner that says, you know, we need to provide energy solutions for the world. That lies in Africa, and it also lies in Trinidad and Tobago, where we have built up, fortunately, over many decades with many world-class players like BP and Shell and Yara and Nutrien and Methanex. All of those players are present in Trinidad. We don't have the gas right now, so our focus is on energy security regionally as well, but also positioning solutions for the region and for the world, because that's what is needed.
Cynthia, you've got, I mean, it's interesting times in North America, obviously, booming gas in Canada and in the United States, but it's the US administration which is primarily calling for no new investment in gas and gas infrastructure projects in the developing world. I mean, do you have a view on that?
Yes. So
is it your fault?
No. What I would say is that we're trying to figure out how to solve this global issue of GHG emissions and coming up with regional solutions. We do need to get our governments to step back and figure out what that balance is. You know, I think we will continue to get through permitting processes and get more infrastructure built in the U.S. You just have to look at the growth we've had already in building LNG infrastructure for over the last 5 years. It's harder. Should it be easier? Probably, but there's things that we need to do to make it easier. So we do need to address our own fugitive emissions and make sure we are addressing things like CCS and even some hydrogen solutions where it makes sense. Now with the IRA that was passed in the US, there is a lot of opportunities to really develop that new infrastructure to be complementary, in my mind, to doing that. We're all challenged right now. It's hard to build any infrastructure. So I think we all have to get out there and explain things better to the voting public who actually help set the policies. So there's more work to do there. But it's a very exciting time, too. This is a real opportunity. There was just a study that came out from Colorado University that said that 5% worldwide, 5% of coal electrical generation across the world is producing 73% or 76%, I can't remember what the number is, of all emissions that come from electricity worldwide. So if you can figure out how to do coal switching for that, and we can find solutions for the really important things. The other thing that I would note is it's critically important to move now, because we know that the longer it goes, you have this cumulative impact. So anything that we can do to capture and use existing technology and existing infrastructure that we have right now to reduce emissions and create that path forward will have that multiplication impact, right? You have that, the sooner you move, the sooner you start the abatement, the sooner you can decrease the overall impact for global warming. So there's a lot of good things happening, but it should be easier, but we're going to have to really lean into this. We are the leaders here in our industry. We know this. We have that expertise. We have the people. We also need to involve others in the advocacy, making sure that we educate everyone, and we have to do a good job of putting ourselves out there and taking accountability for those things that we know we have to improve.
Okay. Yeah.
Maybe a quick add to that. I think there's been a real worrying trend in recent years where developed economies are exporting their standards and enforcing their standards, amongst other things through banks, multilateral development and lending institutions on the developed world. I think it is. It's wrong. It's a pity. It's not in line with equitable transition. And what that means is that you have 4 billion people in the world that uses 10%, consumes 10% of the energy on average of the rich world. And in many of those countries, gas is an absolutely core and essential part of a lowest cost transition to a long-term sustainable future. And by not differentiating and allowing this optimal development pathways to play out, I think the developed world is doing the developing world a big injustice. And I really hope that we'll see a more inclusive approach, including a rethink of those standards by especially the multilaterals and the Western-based big banks that fund the industry.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic, and we might return to it perhaps in our last question. But I want to turn to the audience. You've all got, or I hope you've all got, the LNG 2023 app on your phones. So this is an opportunity for you to participate. We have asked our panelists what they see as the energy mix going forward into the next few decades. But I'd like to ask the audience if you can go to your apps to answer the question on the app, which I'm hoping is going to come up on the screen. There you go. What attribute of natural gas makes it a strong contributor to the energy transition? So if you can go to your apps, I am told you'll be able to make a choice between those answers. If you say something entirely ridiculous, we'll get the panel to comment and criticise you at the end of the session. So while you're doing that, we'll go back to the panel. You can't have a panel about LNG supply and demand, about liquidity, etc., without mentioning the events of 2022, the response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, etc. As a result of that, Europe rushed to replace Russian pipeline gas because they had no other option, and because they had no other options, it reverted to coal generation, coal-fired power generation. What do you think are the lessons that can be learned from that? Are there long-term implications from that shift, or was that just something that just happened last year and we're not going to have to worry about it in the future?
I can
De La Rey?
give it a crack. Look, price spikes are never good. It really damages confidence in the product and therefore sort of reduces the allocation of gas in national energy strategies and mixes and so on. But what happened last year, and I've been in this industry for 21 years, what happened last year was truly unprecedented, just a very abnormal set of circumstances. I do believe the market is working, and the market is working well, and it worked even last year. You saw a very, very prompt response in terms of conservation, energy conservation, gas conservation. You also saw product substitution happen, and you saw within months, you saw the response, the stimulative response on the supply side in terms of new LNG developments. And that had a dampening effect on prices, and it all happened in a very short period of time. So key point for me is the market functions, the market works well. And at the same time, our industry continues to innovate. We find lower and lower cost ways of producing the gas that the world needs. And so I think from my vantage point is that there is enough discovered gas around the world that can be profitably and responsibly produced at price levels that is affordable everywhere, including the developed world. Now, some degree of cyclicality we will always have. LNG is a commodity after all, but price volatility should lessen over time as the industry continues to grow in scale, as there's more and more flexible volume available in the industry. And ultimately, if you want to avoid the risk of severe price spikes, we have to continue to see long-term contracting that steadily introduces new supply into the market. That's ultimately the remedy for price spikes, but there is no reason why LNG cannot be put into the market at the scale that the market desires and at price points that's affordable right around the world.
Okay. Kevin, De La Rey just said it wasn't an example of market failure. Was it an example of policy failure?
Look, I'm not sure we can say that the invasion of Ukraine was a policy failure. I mean, that doesn't quite work for me, that one. But I think what it does highlight is that where policies are focused on shutting down the development of gas, you'd get the same impact. You're taking the transition fuel out of the energy mix, and you give people a very stark choice, no energy or cheap energy, and the cheaper energy would be coal in that instance. And we saw that happen in 2021, 22, and we saw the increase in emissions that came with that. So I think it's a very clear demonstration of how the transition must not happen. And so, you know, I think Cynthia said governments need to take a step back and work together to try and plan this transition and make it a very orderly transition. And there's no doubt in my mind that the best partner for clean fuels and the best partner for renewables in particular is natural gas. And to put the hose on gas just drove the prices up. And it was forced by that war and taking that gas out of the market. But that's exactly the same impact we'll have if we limit supply of gas into global markets. And so I would think there's an argument for saying we need to oversupply. Governments should be trying to drive more supply of natural gas to force coal out of the market. Now, I would say that because I don't sell coal and I sell gas. I get that. That would be the argument. But it just makes perfect sense to me that you should be trying to drive the price of the cleaner fuel to as low as practicable to make that the choice. Particularly, I think Cynthia talked about not everybody having access to electricity. We work in PNG, we work in Timor-Leste, developing projects in those countries. We're trying to build a very large CCS project in Timor-Leste, the Bayu-Undan CCS project, which will capture around 10 million tons of carbon per annum. That creates jobs for that economy. It creates new revenue stream for the Timor-Leste government. And you know, that helps them develop their economy longer term. In PNG, 15% of the population have access to electricity, 15%. And that's not always reliable electricity. And the only way those economies can develop and get the kind of lifestyles that we've all become accustomed to in the richer countries that we built off the back of fossil fuels is to allow them to do that. And if we put our foot in the hose, we will slow that down. It'll be an unjust transition. And we saw it was the poorest countries that suffered the most last year, right? It wasn't the rich countries. They stepped in and they bought the cargoes, they diverted cargoes. And it was countries like Bangladesh, Pakistan, they lost their cargoes at critical times. And that's what will happen again if we do not have a planned transition, just on a much grander scale.
Okay. Cynthia, lessons or implications from last year?
There were many lessons for us, I think, as an industry. I agree that, you know, the market prices adjusted fairly quickly, quicker than I think most people anticipated. But it did point out that there was an imbalance, right? That and maybe it was poor planning or poor policy, I'm not sure, but there hadn't been enough focus on energy security or diversity of supply, right? So I think that's something that we should learn from and that people will learn from. I hope that there isn't an overcorrection now. You know, there's, as we've been talking about how you develop the market for, you know, to meet that trilemma of security, sustainability, and affordability over the next, you know, 10 years, and really still driving towards reducing emissions and being responsible. It does create a kind of a coordinated approach. That is the biggest challenge, I think, for everybody, is to try and get that coordination. You know, there are pockets where you see really, I'd call it disconnected behavior. One example for us is in the US and the US Northeast, where you have these really, really strong energy transition policies that are trying to demonize all of fossil fuels. And they're creating such high energy prices and unreliable sources so that it's very close to breaking. And that's in the United States, where we have so much abundant resources and are so wealthy. You take that and you look at where you have these disconnects throughout the world. How can we work together to address places and, you know, the challenges in India and China? And I think it is up to us to responsibly develop the resources and put them out to the market.
Yeah. Mark, you got any final comments?
Well, I would take, if I just start with the global north and global south, you know, it's over 90% of the emissions are in the global north. And the global south is greatly impacted. So certainly Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean region and small islands all over, as talked about this morning, are experiencing the impacts of those changes. If we get into Europe, which is part of the global north, you would see that I think there are some fundamental lessons to be learned there, because what happened there was sort of pressing the X on the energy transition, going down the road, and then, of course, the war happened. And really and truly speaking, it pointed to, well, the fundamental lesson is you can't focus on one component. You really need to focus on really all the components. So I think that's a fundamental learning that came out of that. I observed that there were, you know, dry rivers for hydroelectric power in Europe, water problems for cooling in nuclear reactors. I mean, all of those impacts have happened, and they will continue to happen. Why? Because the carbon is rising in the atmosphere. And as long as the carbon and methane is rising in the atmosphere, we are going to experience the impacts probably even faster than we all think. In fact, all the studies suggest that that is going to be happening in like 5 years or so, just to be breaching the 1.5 already. So really and truly speaking, getting back to the Europe question, I think the issue of where we go from here has to be the global north reducing emissions, and of course replacing these emissions with cleaner energy. And natural gas is, of course, a big solution as you come away from coal. And as you go back to Europe now, it's really how you make natural gas the flexible sort of component. So it depends on what context we're speaking about here. But for Europe, I think it's important to have that base load, and for any country, it's important to have that firm base load of gas providing that solution for intermittency as renewables increases.
Okay, that's good. Have we got the results from the survey of the audience? We have. What does this tell us? Does this tell us that you're all awake, or does it tell us that no one believes that natural gas is safe? What would you say this said, Mark?
You just said the strongest contributor. They're all contributors. One's the strongest.
Good stands there is flexibility for sure and abundance. But the first one, clean.
Yeah, I wonder who decided to colour it in black. That's it's a bit of a shame. Okay. Look, there's a final question for each of you, and that is related to the developing of gas reserves in energy-poor emerging economies, where demand is often not high enough to justify the investments to develop those reserves. How can those resources be developed and monetarised, particularly, I suppose, in a climate where the development banks are told not to invest there?
Well, maybe I'll start on that one, Milton. The projects we're working in places like PNG and Timor-Leste, their economies could not consume the volume of gas or anywhere close to that we're developing, and so they have to be LNG export projects. And as the panel was talked about earlier on, that flexibility of gas, being able to liquefy and transport it by ship to available markets and close by markets in the case of PNG, make that a good way to develop those projects. And they are vital to the development of those economies because they have not got a developed economy. They don't have reliable electricity systems. They don't have the things that we all take for granted, education, health. They don't have any of that. And so that gives them the revenue streams to help develop those economies. And I think it's absolutely critical that not only are they allowed to, they are encouraged to develop. And that whether it be fiscal policies, the banks, the markets, they've got to get behind developing these projects in these countries, and particularly as part of a transition where something like LNG is seen as a transition fuel to help bring those economies out of poverty. Because if we don't, they're going to burn wood, they're going to burn dung, coal if they have access to it, because they have to heat and they have to eat. I'm going to coin that phrase now. I'm getting pretty sharp.
Good phrase, good phrase. Okay, De La Rey?
Yeah, no, look, I think if you have a project that you would like to develop in an emerging economy, you need the developer. And there's plenty of companies like ours keen to do that.
Yeah.
You need stable, predictable, enabling fiscal environment, government support. By and large, we get there. There are very few governments who are not self-interested in a good way. And you need money. And I think more and more for me, the challenge is if we see more and more banks, and we've seen just in recent months, some of the big names that used to be there for decades funding LNG projects check out. If you see the multilaterals go cold on gas and LNG, then that third ingredient, the money to develop the project, is often the thing that stands on the hose and then robs the country of immensely valuable development opportunity and revenue. And so I hope that we will see, especially within the financial world, more of a sort of I think this morning, a very useful observation, a re-education on the energy transition, what it really takes within the financial system, and that would play through into more support for LNG developments around the world.
Cynthia, is there a role for national governments in developing these resources in emerging countries?
Hopefully. I think that, as was stated by Kevin and De La Rey, we need to look at where we can create these partnerships and how we can attract capital, because money is needed in all of these cases. Part of that is creating a platform where you can attract the funding back to just even in our traditional spaces, even in the Western culture, so you can create that confidence again, so that we can use that same or incremental funding models to access underdeveloped areas. I think that does mean that we also have to empower as we talked about earlier on the panel, empower those developing nations with the ability to chart their own future. But in charting that future, we have to give them options, and we have developed the technology like LNG, and we can make that even more affordable and more accessible, and that helps create that level playing field so that they have the basic energy that they need. Because, you know, as Kevin noted, I think it's something over like 2.6 billion people in this world still cook with like dung and garbage, plastic. That's what they use. I mean, we have to move forward and allow that kind of development. And yeah, it's going to require us to lean in and governments to lean in.
Mark, I was in Senegal last year, and the energy minister of Senegal said to me she thought that, and this came just after John Kerry's comments about not investing, but she said to me, the whole problem here is that it's policy makers in the north dictating the policy takers in the south. Is that what's happening?
Well, to some extent, you heard that kind of narrative that I referred to before,
Yeah.
which is really undermining the need for more energy to come from all sources that you need it to come from. So really and truly speaking, I mean, I was there in Angola, in Mozambique, when, you know, huge reserves were being developed, and of course now they have LNG plants. Of course, in Trinidad and Tobago, we have 3 trains, we have, you know, 10 ammonia plants, 7 methanol plants, but we don't have the gas locally. And therefore, the vision and the need to supply the world and the region can also come through the assets that we have built up in Trinidad over many decades. There's spare capacity, but of course the capacity cannot be through local solutions. It has to be also some regional issues. It involves cross-border. It involves future sources of gas outside of Trinidad and Tobago. But when you look at it, the 10 ammonia plants that sit in Trinidad, that really is supplying quite a substantial portion of the world trade of ammonia. So quite apart from the energy side, there's the food side. And you can't just change plants from gas raw materials to suddenly run on green hydrogen or something like that. So really and truly, the plants that have been built up in Trinidad, there's a clear vision by the government to say, well, let's try to use all the spare capacity that we have. Because it's so concentrated in Trinidad with this ammonia trade, if we were to fully utilize that capacity with regional solutions, then we can also, you know, substantially affect the world trade of ammonia, which is on the food side. So clearly speaking, I think quite apart from the policies, as you say, but it's feeding through the financial markets also. I think that is a very good point to be tackled. But everybody is trying, certainly in the areas of Africa and Trinidad and Tobago, as I just described, will provide solutions not only for our own local country, but is really for the world.
Okay. I have a couple of housekeeping things to finish on, but just before we do that, can we just go, perhaps from the most powerful woman in Canada through to the weakest male in his own house? Could we start with you, Cynthia, and say, is there anything that you haven't said today that you wanted to say at this panel?
I would just say that, you know, we talk about all the challenges, but I do like to think of this as opportunities. We have seen tremendous change and tremendous development of the LNG infrastructure, even over the past few years with the obstacles that we were able to overcome. So I'm very optimistic that we will both move forward with these solutions and continue to find that path to reduce emissions.
Okay. Delaray?
Yeah, just two things. One is if we can continue to ruthlessly drive down the greenhouse gas intensity of gas and LNG sold around the world, and if consumers were to reward companies that do that well, and if gas remains affordable, and there's absolutely no reasonable why gas should not remain affordable, then I have no doubt that gas is part of a long-term net zero energy mix, the bridge between the energy systems of today and of tomorrow.
Okay. And Kevin, final word?
Yeah, look, I mean, quite similar. I'm excited about the role that gas has to play in the energy transition. But it's not enough to just say that it's cleaner than coal and that we rest on that laurel. The fact is it does emit greenhouse gases. And we've got to confront that, and we've got to reduce them. And so that means abating oil and gas, and LNG in particular, given the share of the market that we think LNG is going to have going forward. And I believe that those technologies are almost there, if they're not already there, to do that. And so that's what excites me about the role that gas has. It is cleaner than some other fuels today, but it can be a whole lot cleaner, and it can help us with CCS and CCUS technologies get to that net zero future. There is no pathway to net zero without natural gas and CCUS.
Okay. And Mark?
Yeah, some things I would have liked to see is that the luxury that we don't have luxury of time, because the traditional lungs that we used to depend on, the Amazon and the forests, of course, at 30% are gone, and you see the oceans are also heating up. So it means that it is really essential to get all the balls lined up, from policymakers to companies to governments to communities, and really make sure that we, first of all, understand the data. And it's not the data of just net zero, but it's really understanding where are we with respect to not pledges, but where are we with respect to the measurements of what's going on from where. Because I think we need a more scientific approach now to say, you know, it's not the pledge that is going to help us get there. It's how fast we move in the right areas at the right time, in the right combinations, and all have to be, of course, collaborating to get there. It's not going to be a BP or Shell or NGC or, you know, Santos going to solve this problem alone. But I think really once we understand the data which we lack from a measurement point of view, it means that I don't know what is going to come out in COP28 and so on, but I hope to see that there's not just a question of pledges, but it's a question of understanding where we are, so that when you kind of put this conference together with the COP28 and all of these things, we can see a story emerging that says, you know, natural gas is a very critical, you know, fundamental pillar in getting us from point A to point B. I'm not sure those dots are connected quite yet.
Okay, that's a good note to end on. I'm told to advise you that after this session, if you enjoyed this topic, there's a slide that's about to come up magically. Slide has come up magically. If you enjoyed this topic, here are some suggested sessions you might want to attend, or look at the papers from those sessions or the online material. I'd like to thank all our panellists today. I think it's been a very informative and interesting discussion. I think we've all learned a fair bit. Santos is going to fix the problem, so we're all going to be happy. I'd like to also advise you that a donation has been made to Second Harvest in your names in honour of your contribution today. Second Harvest is a non-profit that prevents good surplus food from being wasted by collecting it and redistributing it to feed those people in need. So thank you very much for your efforts on the stage and back in your home companies. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great. And now the